Good evening, friends. Welcome back to TMYS Academy. Today I am with Dr. Jeffrey D. Logue. He is a professor of religion and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania. He specializes in the religions and philosophies of India. He is the author of A Vision of Hinduism, Jainism, An Introduction and the Historical Dictionary of Hinduism. His forthcoming work is titled Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. It is due for release in August of this year. In 2018, Dr. Logue received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his ongoing efforts to promote more accurate and culturally sensitive portrayals of Indic traditions in the American educational system and popular media. He has spoken in numerous venues across the world and has given 3 talks at the United Nations. Today, we are here to discuss Hinduism as a field of study, the language and literature, history and the philosophy, the rituals and practice in life, the people and inspiration. Today, we are here to discuss Hinduism outside India in connection with Dr. Logue's upcoming book, Hinduism in America. Today's session is something which is very, very different and very, very empowering because today the world is discussing religion, not spirituality. We are discussing religion on different contexts, trying to malign each other in terms of religion, trying very hard not to understand each other's religious beliefs, each other's religious ethos. Instead, we are fighting, we are blaming, we are picking up stories, and we are probably spoiling a lot among each other rather than using religion as a spiritual step to build ourselves up. In that context, I am connected to Dr. Jeffrey D. Logue. Welcome, Dr. Logue, to TMYS Academy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So, Dr. Logue, I'll head straight towards the questions that I have. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, I have been hearing your talks on various platforms, on YouTube and otherwise. And one thing that I traced out from which I want to begin this session is that I found that you are very close to your father and seem to be searching for answers since the time you lost him. So, does the philosophy of Hinduism help you in any way to keep in touch with him? If yes, why and how? Why Hinduism over any other religious philosophy?
Okay, very good questions. So, yes, my journey really begins when I was a child, growing up in a small town in the state of Missouri, here in the US. And my father I was very close to my father. I'm the only child in my immediate family. So it was just my mother and father and myself. And he was in just a horrific auto accident when I was 10 years old. And as a result of his injuries, it was very debilitating and left him with a lot of medical problems. And when I was 12, he actually ended up taking his own life rather dramatically. And it was very clear to me that he was trying to escape from the prison that his body had become.
Mm-hmm.
And this, in fact, made a very deep impression on me at an early age because I realized we are not this physical body, right? We identify with this body, but it's really the vehicle for our true self. If the body can turn against you, if it can be a prison, then that suggests that it is something distinct from we ourselves as subjects. And so, and of course, I grew up in a Christian tradition in the Catholic faith, which also taught that we have a soul. But I began to really understand more and more. It's not simply that we have a soul; we are the soul. We are spiritual beings, and this whole experience with my father really made me start thinking a lot about issues like the afterlife. What happens after we die? How can we know if anything happens, right? How can we know if there's an afterlife? Then I started reading as much as I could and exploring not only the faith I grew up in, but many different religions, many different philosophies. I always liked to read, so I started gathering books on everything. And in terms of Hinduism, what I found was every tradition I looked at, every religion and every philosophical system had some insight that I agreed with. I found that there's wisdom everywhere to be found. what I particularly found attractive about Hindu tradition, and especially about Vedanta, is that it seems to have the capacity to incorporate the insights of all the other traditions into itself. And you might notice I have this picture of Sri Ramakrishna behind me, and one of my early readings on Hinduism was about Sri Ramakrishna and how he practiced many religions and found realization in each of them, how he taught that these are all different paths to achieving some kind of realization or union with or connection with a higher divine reality. And that really attracted me. And where I was growing up, there were a lot of different forms of Christianity in America. And there were some very, very conservative folks that I knew who said that if you don't belong to our church, if you don't follow our particular form of Christianity, you're going to hell, you're condemned. They thought Catholics were condemned, and I was Catholic, and we were that's still a part of Christianity, but they didn't even like the Catholic Church, much less Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. They just condemned all of those things without really knowing anything about them. And I found the attitude I found in the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi. All of these great thinkers talk about religions being many roads, many paths up the mountain, many rivers flowing into the same ocean. And so this, and also the idea of rebirth, which I found also very attractive. All of these things made sense to me. So I it really I would say Hindu in terms of my basic worldview, my practices, my day-to-day life. The form of Hinduism that I follow, though, is that taught by Ramakrishna, which really sees truth everywhere. I don't say, well, this book or this thinker is not Hindu, so I can't read that. I don't. It's that open-minded approach that I like so much. So that's what I have carried on with in my life.
Professor, I had been wondering that Hinduism is practiced nationally in very less countries across the world. There is Buddhism, there is Islam, which are far more popular. And I had been wondering that how come you have chosen Hinduism? And in the last 5 minutes that we have been talking, you have not for once named any of the Hindu devas and devis. You have spoken about Hindu scholars and Hindu philosophers. So,
Mm.
is it a fair assumption to make that the way you attach with Hinduism is more scholastic than religious?
I think that's probably true. My wife is from India and grew up Hindu, and my father-in-law, who just passed away a short time ago, always told me that I'm a jnana yogi. So for me, it is very philosophical. Yes, it's very much about. I think I'm more of a jnana yogi, more of a Raja yogi too. I love meditation and my meditation practice. Now, for me, the devas, the devis, the devatas are also extremely important part of my practice, and at the same time, I interpret those through a philosophical lens. It's very different to be drawn to this tradition from my vantage point than to grow up with it in India, because I have most of my friends who are Hindu grew up in India or in an Indian family here, and it's just in everything. It's woven into the entire culture, and for me, it's almost like you could compare it to someone learning how to ride a bicycle by reading a book, whereas most people in India, they grow up riding the bicycle and learning it in a very direct sort of physical way, which for me it was much more of an intellectual process, and the rest came later.
Okay. So, born a Christian and now a Hindu scholar, if I may say so. So, during this journey in your personal or professional or social life, did you ever make a conscious effort to adapt to or give up any practice or ritual or habit or lifestyle? Was there any conflict ever? Because you have just spoken about this, your smooth transitioning into Hinduism because you connected with a lot of things very organically.
Yes.
Was there anything else to it?
There are a couple of things I should mention. Simultaneous, of course, with my process of being drawn to Hinduism, this was Over the course of, I would say, about 12 years, from the time I was about 12 years old till the time I got married, met my wife and got married. So it was a gradual transition. It was not
Mhm.
sudden. What I found was I felt less and less connected with the tradition I grew up in. I think it shaped me in many good ways, gave me a lot of good values. I I'm glad that I've studied, Christian theology and so on. And I went to a Catholic university for my undergraduate. I went to University of Notre Dame, which is a heavily Catholic environment. And I just realized over the course of time that I did not connect very deeply with a lot of the things going on in that tradition. I found very deep wisdom there, but there are a lot of things I didn't agree with and things I couldn't relate to. And I had at that time a few Hindu friends. I met some graduate students while I was there who were from India, and we just connected immediately. And I felt right at home. And so for me, I guess it wasn't so much that I had to give up something first in order to make the transition, because I was already sort of pulling away, I think, or realizing that there were certain things I never really fully accepted in the tradition I grew up in. I mean, there's certain basics I accepted, but a lot of what I think of as the more limiting concepts, I never really bought into all of that. So there was that. I see the other aspect, I think, has been what I would call more the embodied or the physical aspect of Hindu practice, like ritual, like puja and so forth. Like I said, people in India grow up with these things and it's very comfortable and it's what people are used to culturally. I had to adapt to how to do the ritual. So just give you a funny example. The very first time someone offered panchamrit to me in my hand, it ran down my arm and between my fingers and was just a terrible mess because I had no idea how to do that, how to respond to that. Now I do. It's very smooth, and it's in fact, I've learned how to do some of the pujas. This is another whole story, but I actually have received training from a very wise purohit here in the US, and I've learned how to perform the wedding ceremony. I've done 4 Hindu weddings. um, I now know how to do these things. But again, it's for me, it was awkward physically at first to do the various rituals, to just do the physical gestures and so forth, because it's not what I was accustomed to.
True.
People, that and I still observe that people who've grown up Hindu do these things very smoothly, and for me, it's something I've had to acquire.
Sure. So, what also fascinates me about you is that you have learned Sanskrit, something that I must confess that I don't know. So, you are in touch with the core religious texts of Hinduism from its very basic language, the language in which it was conceptualized, conceived. So, I would like to know from you how different is Hinduism in English compared to Hinduism in Sanskrit? I'm asking you this because the impact of language is perhaps very important in religious practice. It explains a lot of things in a particular way or sets the tone for it. And I'm also asking whether internalizing the philosophy gets any deeper when it is studied through the original language of its sacred and intellectual texts.
Oh, okay, that's a wonderful question. And in fact, I remember earlier in my journey, when I was in my teenage years and then getting into college and so forth, senior people would tell me, well, to really understand these things, you need to read them in the original language. And the translations don't really convey everything. And I was skeptical about that at first because the translations I was reading were so wonderful. Right? I was really enjoying what I was reading, but I could tell right away. I mean, before I even graduated from high school, I had 6 different translations of the Gita. They're all different, which right away tells you that there's some subtlety that is not captured in any one of them. It requires multiple translations to sort of get at the nuance of these things. And so the short answer to your question is yes, it makes an enormous difference. Since I've been studying Sanskrit, I started formally studying it in my first year in graduate school. And I lived in India for a couple of years during grad school, and that's when I was able to really immerse myself in it more fully. And I've found that knowing the original Sanskrit makes an enormous difference in terms of understanding the text. And now I find when I read translations, I'm engaged almost in an internal argument with the translators. Well, I would have said that a little bit differently than that. And that language is never a matter of simple one-to-one correspondence, that each language, and especially Sanskrit being such an ancient language, so rich with philosophical connotations and spiritual depth, uh, that many terms don't have an exact uh, one-to-one English sort of correspondent. So to really get at the text, yeah, I think you do need to read it in Sanskrit. I think it's and that's an easier thing, I think, for many people in India to do, because a lot of the Indian languages are based on Sanskrit. Right? So Bangla, Hindi, I mean, these all go back to Sanskrit. Whereas for a Westerner, you're learning an entirely new vocabulary. You know, the words, everything is new. So it's a challenge, but it's definitely a worthwhile challenge to meet. And I find I'm still learning too. I would, if you ask me how is your Sanskrit, I would not call myself proficient. I would call myself competent. I know the basics, but there's still things I need to look up and I need to ask other scholars about from time to time. But the more I practice, you know, the easier it becomes. And it's true. You really get a certain level of depth, and you start to understand how the translations are a little bit off, just because they're translations. It's not because the people who made them are, you know, flawed in some way. It's just the nature of language.
So, Hinduism outside India is something that we had set to understand and base this conversation on that. And you have written a book called Hinduism in America. And the little that exposure that I have, I find people outside India identifying with karma and yoga and spiritual discourses that try to explain the soul. Now, what was specifically lacking in this identification, which pains and inspires you to understand the philosophy deeper, read and write more about it, and explain its intervention to people in scholarly and non scholarly context?
Mm. That's a wonderful question, and
Yeah.
I would say that you're right that for those who are interested outside of India in Hinduism, you have spiritual discourses. There is information available about the basics of the philosophies and so on. And then, of course, there is this whole very rich lived tradition. And I think what pains me is that in the Western world, if you say the word Hinduism, there are a lot of, I think, often unconscious negative associations that arise in
Mhm.
people's minds. There's been a lot of exoticism. There's been a lot of course, for over 100 years, almost 200 years, you know, the British were dominant in India, and there, even today, continues to be a big Christian missionary effort to convert people. So there's sort of an assumption that Hinduism is something that's somehow backward and needs to be, you know, replaced or superseded somehow. And you find even many people in India have internalized this idea. And of course, every tradition has, you know, certain things that need reformed or revised within it. But it seems to me that for all of its riches, for all of the wonderful philosophies and practices and life transforming potential that this tradition has, for it to be associated in the minds of so many people in the Western world with either the caste division of society, sacred cows, you know, these sort of very stereotyped images that
Mm,
people have. I guess if you wanted to put it in the most dramatic way, you know, the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, right?
right.
There you are. There you have the whole sort of negative depiction. And and then when people are attracted to this kind of philosophy in the West, they go to Buddhism. Now, there's nothing wrong with Buddhism, and Buddhism is wonderful, but Buddhism has been represented in the Western world as the tradition with the subtle psychology, the subtle philosophy, and then Hindu traditions have been identified with, you know, things that the West regards as exotic or problematic. In fact, Buddhism has all of those same exotic things as practiced traditionally in Asia, and Hinduism has all of the depth and the philosophy and the psychology as well. So I find the two traditions more similar than different, but there's a complicated history of how these two have been depicted in the Western world, and Buddhism has come off far better in that conversation.
Mhm.
And so if you ask the average American to associate, you know, if you just do sort of a word association game and you say Buddhism, people will think peace, philosophy, psychology. And then, you know, you say Hinduism, a lot of people will come up with the kind of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom sort of images. And I think this is just a really inaccurate, and not just inaccurate, but it also has two negative effects on human beings. Of course, it makes Hindus in America feel marginalized, right?
Mm.
A lot of times people in India often forget that, in India, of course, Hinduism is the religion of the vast majority of people, the Dharma, vast majority of people. In America, it's less than 1% of the population. So Hindus are a minority in America. And like minorities everywhere, there's a lot of misunderstanding and people who are, maybe not that interested in really, understanding things correctly. And so people feel the effect of that prejudice. And then, of course, it also has an effect, I think, on the Westerners themselves, because they're depriving themselves of this wonderful philosophy that they could engage with, but they've decided they're turned off by it before they've even given it a serious look. So I think this attempt to really represent it, as well as other traditions have been represented in the West, I think is very, very important. It's become one of my causes in life.
Beautiful. So, you have spoken to many forums across the world and have met many great scholars and leaders. Would you like to recall a discussion or debate or praise or criticism of your research which left significant impact on your learning or left you hungry to seek more?
Okay, well, in fact, this kind of thing is happening all the time, so it's actually even difficult to respond. I've found that in terms of, I guess this is not a specific incident, but maybe just more of a general statement. But there's a process that we go through in the scholarly world in all fields of peer review, right? So
Yes.
you put many months and years of effort into writing this piece, and you send it, and someone tears it apart and tells you that you're all wrong, and you should have read this book and you should have read that book. And I found that this has a very interesting, this has had a sort of twofold effect upon me. First of all, of course, the intended goal is it improves your scholarship, because if you take seriously all of those criticisms and incorporate them into the work, the end product is much superior as a result. And I think particularly my Hinduism in America book that's soon to be published, went through a couple of rounds of peer review, and I have to say that as difficult as it can be on the ego to read some harsh comment about something you've written, it's really very beneficial. And so I've learned to thank all of those anonymous reviewers through the years who have actually improved my work with their criticisms. And that also has, I think, in terms of the spiritual path, a good effect, because, of course, it's all about overcoming ego and realizing there's something much more important than you and your sort of ego gratification involved. But you asked about a specific incident, and I do want to mention, I would say probably for me, the most memorable experience that I've had in terms of meeting great scholars and great thinkers. In 2013, there was an interfaith forum in Delhi in which I was really pleased to participate, and the Dalai Lama was there.
Oh,
And so I had an opportunity to meet the Dalai Lama. He had been one of my heroes for years, and every semester I do a unit on Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and I show a video which is a biography of the Dalai Lama. So he had been this very prominent figure in my mind for a long time, as if Vivekananda or Gandhi were alive today, right? The Dalai Lama is one of those world historic figures of that kind. And I met him, and the experience was really incredible, because first, when we met, it was very, very brief, but he looked at me and he spoke to me as if I was someone that he had known for a long time. And I thought for a moment that perhaps he was mistaking me for someone else, just because it was his whole tone and expression was so familiar. It was like, oh, my good friend, I mean, that was the vibe that he gave. And then I realized afterward that no, this is how he approaches everyone.
hmm.
And I've had time to reflect on the experience. And what I realized is that when he spoke to me, I had all of his attention. And there's this popular expression, I don't know if it's even true, that we use a very small percentage of our brain, at any given time, and so on. But it was as if the entire power of his mind was focused just on me for that moment. And to have the full attention of someone is an amazing experience. And, it's actually very, very rare,
Mm.
because even with our dear friends and loved ones, when we're speaking to them, how often are we fully present to them? Isn't there some part of our mind that's thinking about, oh, I have to do this next, or I forgot to do this earlier today, or even thinking of what you're going to say next to the person as they're speaking to you? We have all these voices in our minds that we try to quiet when we meditate.
Very
And
true.
my sense with the Dalai Lama was that none of that was happening. There was no noise in his mind. He was fully focused on me. And then when he spoke to the next person, he was fully focused on the next person. And it just made me realize that if we would all pay better attention to each other and be present to one another, we would all be in bliss, because it just makes you feel like you're the center of the universe at that moment. And so I said that's what probably one of the most profound experiences I've had. Um, I guess another quick one that I'll mention is there was when I first really became involved with the Ramakrishna tradition, it was because of a conference that my wife and I attended, and a number of the speakers were swamis of the Ramakrishna order, and I was fresh from graduate school at the time, and I had every expectation that the really interesting presentations would be the ones given by my fellow academic scholars. And I saw the swamis, and I thought, well, they'll say a prayer, or they'll say something nice, and maybe something inspiring, while we're all there. But I didn't expect anything of any great academic import. The best presentations at that conference were the ones given by the swamis. They were both on a spiritual plane, but also intellectually and from a scholarly perspective. I mean, they knew their stuff, right? They were serious scholars, um, and at the same time coming with the full weight of this spiritual practice that they live by. So that really impressed me deeply, and that's one of the things that's drawn me to this particular branch of Hindu tradition, is that the swamis and the Ramakrishna order are very scholarly, very wise, and I would have to say, to this date, all of my experiences with them have been just excellent. And so I mean, those are some of the more prominent experiences I've had.
Okay, super. So, I would like to know from you. I had been listening to to many of the talks that you have given, the forums that you have attended, and it was really nice to see. Especially, you were talking Brahmana and Veda, uh, and at times the camera did flash on the audience, and I could see more of Western audience and hardly any Indian audience.
Mm.
So, a few things I want to know from you on these things. That why don't you tell us the best audience you have ever had in your lectures? Do you enjoy it more when they are calm and reflective, or you like it more when they are restless and participative?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. So I think probably my favorite audience. It was in India, in fact, and at Belur Mat near Calcutta. It was for an event for the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, and there were approximately 15,000 people in the audience. Well, I
Mhm.
had never spoken to a group of more than a couple of hundred people, and most of the time in my classes, it's maximum 35 students, maybe usually even less. So I was a bit nervous,
Mhm.
and I sort of closed my eyes, and I thought about Swami Vivekananda when he first gave his famous welcome address in the U.S. And I was not planning to say this, but it just sort of came out of my mouth before I could stop it. It said, "Sisters and brothers of India," which is very similar to how he started his. And after I said it, the people loved it. They were applauding, and they were having. It was a very warm and welcoming crowd, and I immediately felt relaxed. And then I gave my presentation, and everything went smoothly after that. But of course, with the big audience, the problem is you don't get a lot of interaction, right? There's not time
Mm.
to take questions and answers and so on. So to go to the second half of your question, I say I prefer audiences that are. Attentive while I'm speaking, but then who have a lot of questions and want to
Mm.
engage, because that shows me that they've been listening, and it also gives me an opportunity sometimes to go into topics that I was not able to cover. When you're asked to cover a topic, you speak on that topic, and you don't get into things like, the story of my father or my life experiences. But people will often ask about those things, and so it then gives me an opportunity to go into other areas. And I find sometimes that's the best part of a presentation, is the discussion afterward.
Okay. Something that I also wanted to ask you is, when you are presenting in front of a Western audience, what are questions that you face? Because I understand that you are not always presenting to an audience who is culturally adaptive towards Hinduism. There must be times when you are presenting before an audience uh, who has come there to take the experience, but not necessarily uh, understand Hinduism to that effect, or are not already well read in that subject. What kind of
Yes.
questions do you receive, or what does the world need to understand or want to understand, or how do they see Hinduism as a religion
Right.
or as a philosophy?
Well, and this, of course, is where a lot of those sort of stereotyped understandings of Hinduism come up, because people will ask questions based on their previous education with Hinduism, which is often very little. And so I will get questions about, well, okay, I'll be talking about Vedanta philosophy, and someone will say, how does caste fit into this? How do sacred cows fit into this? These sort of stereotyped images. And it's actually very good, because it gives me an opportunity to then contextualize those things and expand upon those things, and show people how there's much more going on in the tradition than the stereotypes they've received. And so with the Western audiences, it's very much about making an effort to show that there is something very positive to be found in these traditions. And so it is a different type of presentation. When I'm speaking more to an Indian audience, this has very often been in not so much an academic context, but more like the context of a temple or a Vedanta society. And so I can assume that people know a lot more. And then I can talk about other things. I can get into more depth about the philosophy and the texts and so forth. But I find very often with the American audiences, now with an American scholarly audience, of course, that's yet another type of audience. Those are also
Mm.
people who are very knowledgeable, and you present in a certain way that fits with how people speak in an academic environment. It's probably has a lot more technical kind of jargon involved, and you can get again into depth on certain things that you can. But a lot of my audiences are of non-specialists who are just curious. They want to know more about the tradition. And so locally, for example, I live in a rural area. I get a lot of requests to speak in high schools, a lot of requests to speak in churches. And the churches are especially interesting, of course, because you have a group of people who are religiously committed, but to a very different tradition than what I'm presenting. And so, again, I need to present it in a way that is authentic and faithful to what Hindu traditions teach, but at the same time, that is not going to, sort of offend, or, some people may be offended anyway, but, some people are offended no matter what you do. But to not try to sort of provoke any anxiety on the part of the people that you're speaking to, because they're already sometimes anxious, right? They already think, okay, this tradition is very different and strange, and I'm not sure how I should feel about it. And so if I present it in a way that is, makes it approachable, um, and understandable to them, then I find that's what works best in those environments.
Sure. My last question, Professor. Your book, Hinduism in America, which is expected to release sometime in August. So I wanted to ask you that, why don't you tell me this journey of research, the kind of people you met while writing this book, and what all you may have discovered about yourself in the course of this journey.
Okay, wonderful. This book has been really a wonderful journey, and I would say of all the books I've written, it's been one of the most challenging and one of the most mind expanding for me, because first of all, I was not originally intending to write this. It was not my idea to write this book. This
Mhm.
project was brought to me. So, but prior to that, for about 20 years or so, I've been attending Hindu temples, being a part of our local Hindu community, being active in the Vedanta Society. And so, and I was always curious about many, many things. So I asked a lot of questions. I conducted a lot of what you could call informal interviews with people, and took notes, and sort of developed this pretty large backlog over the years of just my own personal, I suppose you could call it anthropological field research, but I wasn't planning to do anything with it. It was just for my own understanding as a scholar and a practitioner. And then a friend of mine, Anne Gleig, who has written a wonderful book on Buddhism in America, she had been approached by Bloomsbury to write this book, and she suggested that they approach me. So I'm very grateful to her. They approached me with the project, and I said, well, that would be great. I would enjoy writing that. And so, you know, in terms of the people I've met, in terms of my own journey, I've gotten to know a lot of people in our Hindu American immigrant community, mostly people from India. And then, of course, I've also, in the course of my journey, met a lot of people like myself, Westerners who were drawn to Hindu traditions for our own personal reasons. And these are really two distinct groups that are beginning to blend more and more. And in this, I call the subtitle of the book, I call it A Convergence of Worlds, because I'm talking about the worlds of Hindus who come from India or from other places outside the US and are working very hard to preserve their traditions here and pass them on to the next generation. And then you have people like myself who are seekers, who are, you know, sort of were looking to find something that they weren't finding in the dominant Western culture. And my idea was to combine both of these, because uh, the existing literature on this field is divided into studies of Hindus who've come to America and studies of groups based, you know, mostly made up mostly of Westerners who are based on the teachings of a particular Hindu teacher, a particular guru who's come to America. But increasingly, these are one phenomenon because, well, for example, at a Vedanta society, it's not uncommon to see a group of mostly Indian or Indian descended children and young people learning about the Vedas from a white man wearing an
Mm.
orange robe, and who grew up here and may have a South Carolina accent or a New York accent. And so Hinduism in America is a blending of these worlds. And there is yet another world emerging too of the young people who are growing up in America. Their parents or maybe grandparents came from India, but for them, the American experience and the Hindu experience have been both integral to their upbringing. And of course, you also have now the second and third generations of Westerners who were drawn to Hinduism. There were people who became Hare Krishnas in the 60s, and now their grandchildren are growing up in the ISKCON tradition. So their experience, I didn't get as much of that sort of next generation experience in the book as I would have liked. I sort of gestured towards it because there was also already so much to talk about
Yes.
between the immigrant community and the sort of Western seeker community. So I've interacted with a lot of fascinating people as I've done this. I would say my probably deepest gratitude, much of it goes to our local Hindu community here in Pennsylvania that have welcomed me. I was on the board of trustees of our temple for 3 years. I've been welcomed as an integral part of the community, and it's given me a really wonderful opportunity to see things from sort of a both insider and outsider perspective. Outsider
Mm.
in as much as I've, you know, not grown up in the tradition, but insider in as much as I've been allowed to participate and encouraged to participate. Also, of course, our Vedanta societies, and I've had access, really wonderful access to our swamis and pravajakas who've all been very open with information that I've asked them about. And then also friends in the scholarly community who've written about this before, especially in terms of the Western seekers. There's a wonderful book called American Veda by Philip Goldberg. It's become quite a well-known work in this field. And Phil's a very good friend of mine. And in fact, he interviewed me for his book. And I, in turn, have cited his book extensively in mine. Lola Williamson's another scholar. She's written a wonderful book called Transcendent in America. and it's also about Hindu-inspired movements. So these are all scholars who have really given me guidance. And my good friend Pankaj Jain, who at the same time, right around the same time as my book was coming together, he released his book on both Hindu and Jain communities in the US. And of course, I've also done some scholarship on Jainism as well. So there's been a lot of really very helpful people along the way. And those anonymous external reviewers who told me, you should have done this, you should have done that. And hopefully the book is better as a result of my incorporating their suggestions.
Right. Uh, Dr. Long, thank you so much for your time and for answering our questions with so much of detail. I at least learned a lot from you, and I'm sure our viewers will really appreciate this discussion.
Very kind of you. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Totally, thank you so much. And my namaskar to you. And for our viewers, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this session. Uh, this was a very important session for us to understand religion from a different perspective, and it was, of course, contextualized on Hinduism. But then the things that Dr. Long said, I'm sure applies to every religion that we might be talking about. So I look forward to see you again in the next session that we plan. Till then, I know it's lockdown time. It is a social isolation, but not an intellectual isolation. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep writing. Thank you so much.